Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I hope you can hear me. If you cannot hear me, you must do something with your audio. All right. As people join, we'll get started. So I'll go through a few of the housekeeping stuff, and then we'll hand over to James and Mohammed. But yeah, welcome everyone to this tutorial on how to create multiplayer interactive online experiments with Empirica. And so today we'll have an hour-long session, so be ready. Please do check that you can hear me right now and you can see my screen. You can ask questions throughout the session using the Q&A box. Also, you can ask questions in the chat or on the Slack channel that Mohammed and James are already shared, and we'll share again in the chat. So Mohammed and James will take questions after their presentations and the demo, and also at the end. The recording, yes, there will be a recording, and it will go out tomorrow or very soon after we upload it to YouTube. So as we wait for a few more people to join, let's do a little warm up. So if you can use the chat function on Zoom. Have you run an online experiment before? No, okay, Carla. Well, hopefully you'll get some interesting insights and inspiration. San as well. Oh, quite a few. Quite a few are saying yes, and a few are saying no, not yet. Okay. All right. So the next question is going to be, if you have done an online experiment or ran one, what challenges did you have? And if you didn't, maybe what you're anticipating, or why didn't you use online experiments already? Okay, so quite a few people didn't run online experiments. That's well, it's going to be a great section then for you. But also, okay, having a technological tool flexible enough for your design, that's a great one. I think Mohammed is nodding, so Empirica can support that. Scheduling challenges with participants. Oh yes. I think even just finding a time to speak with someone is hard. Getting more people joining at the same time is quite a task. Yes, time issues, design limitations. Okay, so participants tend to put less effort sometimes. Did you try to do anything about it? Or what did you try? Okay, good. Well, hopefully, we'll see if James and Mohammed have some suggestions there. Practical and easy tool. So important to be practical. Yeah, that's a great one. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing now and hand over to James and Mohammed to, if you can introduce yourselves and kick off.
Fantastic. So hi everyone, I'm Mohammed Alsobay. I am a PhD student in the Information Technology group at MIT Sloan School of Management. My primary research interests are in human-AI interaction and how we design algorithms and systems to allow humans and algorithms to interact and achieve better outcomes. And on the side, I'm also interested in kind of methodology and software for enabling better social science experimentation. And that's why I'm here today. James?
Sure. My name is James Houghton. I'm a postdoc with the Computational Social Science Lab at the University of Pennsylvania. My research at the moment is looking into small group deliberation So we're using Empirica to bring small groups together, and they join a Zoom-like interface, and we give them a topic to discuss, and then we see what interfaces and interventions we can use to support their discussions.
Great. So just to set a rough agenda for the tutorial today, I'll present an overview of Empirica, including kind of the motivation for why it exists, the problems it solves, and what the community's been doing with it. After which we can have a brief Q&A session while James sets up the hands-on tutorial. If you haven't had the chance to look at the instructions that the organizers have very helpfully shared last night, it includes instructions on downloading Empirica and the node server, which are helpful if you want to follow along live with the hands-on portion. But if you'd like to do it at your own pace, the repository and instructions will be available after the seminar as well. And we also have a Slack channel where you can go to get help with the tutorial, ask follow-up questions, and James will include that in the chat now. Awesome. Great. So let me get this presentation shared. All right, are we all set? Cool. So I'm really excited to be sharing Empirica with you as a tool for creating.
Mohammed, I'm not sure if you're sharing the right screen.
Oh, really?
I'm seeing what time it is in London.
Oh, that's not. Well, I'd love to talk to you about time zones too, but
that was a question. I saw that in the chat.
Well, we will answer that too. How about now?
There you go.
All right, great. So I'm really excited to be sharing Empirica as a tool for creating multiplayer interactive online experiments alongside the very talented James Houghton. So I'd like to start by posing the question of why we bother experimenting at all. It's a lot of effort. We face a lot of issues, as many of you have highlighted. And so why do we do it? And I think you can succinctly summarize this by saying, well, we want to arbitrate among competing hypotheses. We have different views of the potential views of the world and how systems behave, and we'd like to collect data to support one or the other. But the space of hypotheses that we can test is defined by the experiments we can execute. So if we think of experiments living in a three-dimensional space along the dimensions of scale, duration, and complexity, physical lab experiments occupy a small neighborhood in that larger space. And so if you've run a physical lab or even participated in one as a subject, you're aware that these settings have distinct limitations, whether it's from the pool that you can bring into your physical lab or the types of interactions and the durations that you can have in your experiments in that setting. These physical labs have real limitations. And so the virtual labs offer a promise of an expansion along these three dimensions. So in terms of scale, because you can recruit people from the internet, you have fewer constraints on location, on demographics. So you're not restricted, for example, to university students on your campus. And the kind of the marginal cost of recruitment is low. When we think about the dimension of duration and time, you can enable real-time interaction, which is true in physical labs, but also over longer periods of time. So there are some experiments, for example, that have participants coming back to the platform over periods of weeks and kind of building these long-term interactions, which are much more difficult to do in a physical setting. And along the last dimension of complexity, you can design more interactive tasks, but also gain much more granular data on behavior. So rather than, for example, manually coding and saying, oh, this kind of interaction happened at this time by looking at video recordings, et cetera, every interaction with the platform can be recorded in real time. And so I've painted this really rosy picture of what virtual labs can do. But the question is, have they lived up to the promise? And I think it's reasonable to say that where we've landed today is traditional experiments done cheaper, faster, at bigger scale. And the question is kind of what's holding us back from expanding along these three dimensions? And so one thing that someone already mentioned is participant recruitment and management is difficult. It's really hard to get people kind of in the same place at the same time, piping them around your platform. Tools aren't really set up to do this easily. Another challenge is that task design is still very technically involved. It requires knowledge that not everyone will have, but I think there are ways to design platforms such that it's easier to collaborate with people who do have those skill sets. And on most platforms, kind of these macro scale, kind of 3+ players settings are still a challenge, whether it's managing the updating of information across participants, or just mapping them to the same rooms and taking care of assignment. There are lots of kind of layered challenges with macro scale experimentation that can be challenging. And so with these challenges and others in mind, Empirica is designed as an open source virtual lab platform to balance productivity and flexibility. And so if I think kind of the three main reasons that I use Empirica as an active user, the first is low fuss productivity. The barrier to going from nothing to functional experiment is very low. And now the amount of refinements that you have the flexibility to add on is endless, but going from 0 to 1 is fairly low cost. The second is that the design of the platform encourages you to think of the outcomes of your experiments as being consequences of your design parameters. And so Empirica forces you to think carefully about what you are explicitly and implicitly varying. And the last kind of reason that I think the most important reason that I love using Empirica is the thriving community. So we have over 200 members on the Slack channel, hopefully more once people start to click on the link in the chat. And I'll kind of now elaborate on each of these facets in more detail. So if we think of kind of this ecosystem approach to building a platform, we have kind of the stakeholders or the users, and these can be researchers, so people with a substantive research question to answer, developers, people who are skilled at coding and kind of building these systems, and panels of participants. So these are experimental subjects. And these stakeholders all interact with the experiment management system. And it's useful to think about kind of an experiment management system as being composed of different modules, such that they can kind of plug and play and be added or removed or modified as needed. And so if we think of these modules, they fall under three main categories. The first is modules that are related to experiments. So these can be your specification, the game interface, the monitoring system, and how you deploy it. And the second category is that of subjects. So where do you get your subjects from? How do you store their information? And this is not only in terms of like the granularity of information, but also some people mentioned things about GDPR compliance. That's an important angle of kind of where you're storing your subjects. And these two categories, they intersect in kind of the topics or modules of lobby management. So once you've brought people into your game, how do you manage kind of the synchronization and the waiting period before a game officially launches, and the assignment. And so ranging from simple random assignment to more complicated procedures, this is a module that can vary in complexity. And the last kind of category of modules is that related to the data that you get on your experiment and how you use that to plan future experiments. And so everything with an asterisk is addressed today in some shape or form by Empirica. Some of the things without asterisks are being addressed with future modules, but the beauty of thinking about a platform as taking place in the ecosystem is that any participant in the ecosystem can add a module. Empirica is not kind of a rigid thing in the sense that if you have a specific need for a module that is not currently addressed by the already existing tools, you can add and plug that in seamlessly. And so the first module that I'll go into is the experiment specification. So I'm showing you here a screenshot of the Empirica interface. And the construct that I'm showing you here is factors. So factors are variables that in combination define a treatment. And these are user defined. So for example, here I'm showing you the factors that I'm using for the design of a public goods game for a game theory experiment. And here I can specify that I want my number of rounds to take on certain values. I want, for example, if players can chat with each other or not, to be a Boolean variable. And what's important to note is that these factors are then piped into the code that is driving the interface for your experiment. So for example, if chat is set to false, the chat window will not show up in the experiment while keeping everything else the same. Or if the number of rounds is larger, the code that you write for your game can automatically add instances of rounds and iterate over that as needed. And so you can combine these factors to create treatments. So here I can say my player count would be 2, the number of rounds would be 20, so on and so forth. And the benefit of this design choice, or the way that Empirica presents this, is it allows you to decide what you want to vary, but you have to be explicit about what is being varied and what is being constant. And so even when you're implementing your experiment, there's something that you might not take in as a factor, but you have to code it as a constant somewhere. And the act of doing so helps you realize the implicit choices that you're making in addition to the explicit. And the last point that I'll bring up when we think about experiment setup is we often think about sharing data and open data, but I think equally important for reproducibility and just for open science in general is open experiment. And so as you'll see when you look at James's repository, the entire experiment can be shared as code that you can then clone his repo, run Empirica, and you'll have the same exactly the same game that James designed. But also, you can share your factors and treatments as YAML files. So this makes it easier to document kind of let's say the hyperparameters of your experiment design. The second module that I'll go into is game development. So the Empirica design model has roughly 3 main components. The first is your treatment configuration. So once you've written your game code and you've defined your factors and defined your treatments, and people have been piped into a condition, the treatment configuration has all the factors and variables that the game needs to read to function. The second component is the players. So these can come from anywhere. This can be people in a physical lab. So you can have them sitting in a physical setting, connecting to an instance of Empirica. These can be recruited from any of the platforms that exist today. Any way that you can give someone a link and they can follow it and run a game in their browser, that's a potential source of participants. And once you have the treatment configuration, the players in place, they interact with your game in different ways. So a game is at a high level constructed of intro steps. So these can be your consent form, but also things like instructions, attention checks, etc. And then the actual gameplay takes part in rounds, and rounds are composed of stages. So for example, we can think of a prisoner's dilemma as having 2 stages. The first stage is where you make your decision. The second stage is where you observe the outcome, and then you can repeat that over several rounds for a repeated game. And then the exit step can have things like an exit survey or a code for people to submit on a platform for payment, etc. And so the treatment configuration will interact with your game to change the way that the rounds look, but also the intro and exit, if you like. And the players are called upon throughout the game code. So you can use things such as the player ID or store variables at the player level and call upon them in the game interface. And so callbacks make it very easy to add complex game logic. And a callback is just a way of saying that you want to trigger an action based on an event. And the event can be when a game starts, when a round starts or a stage starts, or when any of these constructs end. And you can also come up with your own logic for these, but these are kind of callbacks that are presented natively by default with every experiment. And then the data model is easily extensible. Anything you want to store about a game, player, round, or stage can be set with a .set method. So you can say, I want to set their decision as a certain value. And then when you want to retrieve it, you can .get decision, and you'll receive the same value that you stored. And so with this, you can design your game to record data at any granularity that you need. The next section is kind of lobby configuration. So how long do we want people to wait for their fellow players to come in? What do we want to happen when we fail to get the numbers that we need? So you can have a game fail to launch and show a message, or you can have it start anyway. And then when we think about assignment, you can have as much or as little control over assignment as you need. So you can say, I want people to be piped in randomly, or you can do custom assignment and write code that pipes participants to conditions using detailed logic. The last point I want to show you is about monitoring. So once you run a batch, which is a set of games, you can see how people are flowing into the platform, progressing through the intro steps, and then progressing through the game with detailed information on the stages that they've reached. And all of this is enabled through the Empirica admin UI, which James will show us later. And so I want to give James enough time to run through the hands-on tutorial. So I'll summarize by saying that if we think about platforms living on kind of this axis of flexibility and ease of use, survey-based platforms might give you a lot of ease, but low flexibility. Having a full-time software engineer gives you a lot of flexibility, but that's a lot of specialized knowledge. And we like to think that Empirica lives somewhere in the top right quadrant. And so a real example is that we've had a junior undergraduate CS student with some slight experience in JavaScript going from 0 to full real experiment in a matter of days. And so the time scale of iteration here is not months, it's not years, it's a lot faster, hopefully. And so just to give you an overview of the community, it's an open source project, so everything is available on GitHub, including the code, but also the issues and discussions of where the platform is heading. We have over 200 members on the Slack channel, and these members collectively have 50 plus experiments across 29 teams and 17 institutions since 2020. These are slightly outdated metrics, so the real numbers are probably a bit higher, but it's also sustainable. And so Empirica has the funding and institutional support to continue improving, and hopefully what you build upon is kind of a solid foundation. It's not going to disappear or stop working. And so if you go to our blog on the website, you can see kind of some detailed stories of how people are using it. But just to kind of give you a whirlwind tour, people have designed interactive games where you assign students to dorm rooms with live chat. You can have games where people see feedback from their peers. And so there's a lot of social information. All of this piping in the back end is done by the platform. People can share information live. Here you have some on the scale of 20 players kind of collaborating and sharing information, which is pretty impressive. We also have, for example, built-in widgets such as sliders. So a lot of these components are not necessarily something you need to build from scratch, but just kind of sweep through. People are doing a lot of different things with the platform. And I think this illustrates the flexibility that we've discussed. And so where things are going in the future are in many different directions. Two of the most exciting that I think I'd like to mention are deployment. And so deployment historically has required some limited knowledge of web hosting, of how apps work, et cetera. And we're trying to move this to a more one-click experience. And the second is adaptivity and automation. So in the ecosystem view, we have kind of this idea of experiment selection. And you can automate some of the administrative tasks required with launching an experiment, but also automate experiment selection with techniques like Bayesian optimization. We're looking into how to integrate these functionalities into the platform. Yeah. So with that, I'll hand it over to James to kind of show you all of that in action.
Thanks. Let me queue up my screen share here. And just everybody tell me if I'm sharing the correct screen. You should see a web page with Node and then my console window.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so today we're going to use Empirica to build the prisoner's dilemma experiment from scratch. So I'm using Empirica version 2, which is our latest version, and includes a lot of capability and stability upgrades from version 1. We have about 30 minutes, so I'm going to go through things pretty quickly, and I won't go into super depth on React or JavaScript, because there's lots of really good resources for learning those, and you don't want to hear it all from me. And so instead, I'll focus on what's unique to Empirica. And we have this session recorded, so we can go back through it again later on, and you can slow down if there's parts that were confusing, or ping us on the Slack channel for more information. My hope is that by the time we're done, you'll know where to start, and you'll get a sense for thinking about the design of an experiment that sort of sparks some ideas for you about what you want to build. And even if you don't understand everything, you'll know what you want to learn next. So before we can get started, you need to install Node. And Node is a runtime environment that lets us run JavaScript outside a browser. And this is nice because it means we get to use the same language on the server that we're using for the participant display. So it makes it easier to learn. I've already got that installed, so I'll move on. Next, we need to install Empirica. So on the Empirica website, one of the tabs here is called Setup, and the installation script is something you can just copy out and paste into your terminal window. And all this is doing is downloading the installer and running it. And I just got to put my password in here. There we go. And Empirica is installed. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Empirica to set up a template experiment. And so the command for this is Empirica create, and then you give it the name of the experiment you want to make. And when I run this, what it's going to do is it's going to create a directory for my experiment and populate it with the template code that we're going to work with. So it'll give us a running experiment that we can play with, and then make modifications to. So if I enter this directory and type Empirica, then what will happen is that the Empirica server will host a development environment for us, and we can actually run in and see this happening on our browser. So if I type localhost 3000, we get the participant view. And we're in development mode, so what we see here is for the developers. And we don't have any experiments running at the moment because we haven't started them yet. So we see that it directs us to the admin console. On the admin console, there we go. We can see a number of different pieces. So there's a space where I can create a batch, and once we've got one created, it'll show all the different batches that are currently open. I can see the players that are currently using the platform, which is none of us yet. And then here I can see the treatments that have been defined. So the template experiment ships with a solo game and a 2-player game, and then the factors and lobbies. So what we'll do here is I'll just go ahead and, I don't want to lobby config, I want a new batch. Create a new batch with 2 players, and I'll just create one of them, one game. with a standard lobby. And I'll start that experiment. Great. Now what happens is if I come back to my player screen, I can see first thing it asks me for is the login. And I can actually do this on multiple players. So this is a 2-player game. I can in the dev mode, we have access to this little elephant button, which gives you some tools for moving through as a developer. So I'll just create a new player here. Have 2 players open. So this will be James 2. And the first thing that we see is the intersection. So as Mohammed mentioned, the intersection is asynchronous. And it's a great place for consent and instructions and all of those things. So if I click through both of these, it'll say first waiting for the other guy to be ready. And when he is, it puts us through to the game. So this is a game with 2 rounds, different types of games. And this first round has 2 different stages. And what we'll see here is if I guess the number of jelly beans and submit my answer, first I wait for the other player. And then when the other player submits their guess, we go to a new stage where it shows us both of our answers. If I submit again, we go on to the next round. And this actually is a Minesweeper game. And this demonstrates some of the live sharing capability between the 2 players. So when one player takes an action here, it shows up immediately on the other player's display. So this is a nice way that players can work together to solve the problem. And then when we're done with that round, we move to the exit steps where you can have surveys or payment instructions and give a debrief on the experiment. All right, now let's look at the code that makes this experiment run. I'm going to open up a new tab here, and I'm going to use Visual Studio Code to look at this game. So the template experiment ships with a couple of folders. Most of the stuff that we're going to see here is boilerplate or it's for advanced use. And we'll only work with about 5 of the files that I'm going to show you. So the server folder here stores all the code that runs on your server. Makes sense. The client is all the code that runs in the browser that your participants are going to see. And the .empirica folder shows data and config files that we're going to need to run the experiment. So let's go into the code that shows the jelly beans example to the participants. That's under client, source, examples, jelly beans. And what you see here is React syntax. So we use React framework in Empirica, which is a web language that basically is just a bunch of functions that return HTML. And we can use these functions to build up our display in bite-sized chunks that we can then compose together to make a whole page. And so sort of an overview of this page, first thing we're doing is we're exporting this function, which is the jelly beans example. And then the component is using some hooks, which are getting access to the Empirica components. And then it has some functions that manage the state and the life cycle of this component itself. And then down here, it's got a return statement, which is returning this JSX syntax, which is basically just wrapped up HTML. And then let's go and look at the code that runs on the server to manage this game. So in the server folder under source callbacks, what you see is a number of functions that get run each at a different stage in a game lifecycle. So this top function here on game start gets called when a new game is launched and players are in it. And all that it's doing right at the moment is creating the round and the stage that we're going to use throughout the game. And there's a number of other callbacks here. So when the round starts, when the stage starts, when the stage ends, currently the stage calculates the score for the jelly beans example. And there's a bunch more of these that you can use. So for this demo, we're going to clean out all the code for jelly beans and minesweepers. And we'll use the same scaffolding to build up our own experiment. So I'm just going to take this out here for now. And we'll come back and recreate some of this stuff later. In the context of the Prisoner's Dilemma game. I'll save that, and VS Code's formatting my code for me real nice. I don't need the examples, so I'll take those out. And lastly, what I'll do is in this stage file here, this is where we tell Empirica which stages, which components to display given when we're in a particular stage of the game. So here's a case which just says when I'm in this part of the game, display this. we'll come back to this in more detail in a bit. And I don't need these import statements anymore either. All right, there we go. So now we're ready to get started. I'm going to just do a quick server restart to make sure that I've got a real clean environment here. Let's close the old server and give it a quick start there. All right, ready to go. So let's go ahead and create our two-player game again, and then we can see what's happening as we move through. Get that started and come back here. So we got player 1 is James, player 2 is James 2. All right, so this is the intro screens that we had been seeing before. And what we want to do first is to set up some introductory text to say what the player is going to be expected to do. And so I'll do this in client source intro exit. And we've got currently an introduction.jsx file. And this is just wrapping up some HTML that it's displaying to the user. So we can replace that HTML with our own. So here I'm just using a couple of paragraph tags with a little bit of light styling to give us this display. What we're going to tell them is, in this game, you will be partnered with another experiment participant. And in each round of the game, you and your partner will A, choose whether to work together or to look out for your own interests. This is the prisoner's dilemma. And then B, see each other's choices and the results of those choices. And you notice that when I made these changes and saved the file, it automatically changed what I was seeing in the browser. And that's because the Empirica dev server has hot module reloading, so it's going to propagate those changes for us immediately. So now what we need to do is we actually have to put this together. We have to have a section which allows participants to make a choice, and then we have to have a component which shows them those choices. So what I'll do here is I'll create a new folder where I'm going to keep these, and I'm going to call it stages. And in the stages folder, I'll create a file called choice.jsx, where we'll have the code for the choice that participants make. And I'm going to give this some boilerplate code here. So I import React, and then I export this function choice. And what it's doing at the moment is just returning this div that says that the choice couldn't be implemented yet. And then we'll do this again for the result. So give it a new file, alt.jsx, and then put in some boilerplate code for it as well. Cool. So now what we need to do is we need to tell Empirica that we're going to have these rounds. So we're going to go back to our server callbacks and go to the onGameStart callback here. And this again is the callback that starts once players are assigned to a game. And so what we're going to do is first we're going to say to Empirica, hey, I want you to add a round to this game. So I can get the game object from the callback and say add a round. And then the name of the round is just for now going to be round. And once I have that round, I can add those stages to it. So I'll have a stage which is called choice and a stage that's called result. And for now, I'm going to set the duration of both of those stages to something really long, because that'll help us in our development as we look at those stages. Now that we've told Empirica that we have these stages and we've defined the outlines of the components that'll display during those stages, we need to connect them up to each other. So the place we're going to do this again is that stage.jsx file. And the first thing we want to do is we want to figure out what stage we're in. So we're going to use a hook that is provided by Empirica that gets us the stage. And this is called useStage. And this useStage hook is really just a function that is going to go to Empirica and say, hey, give me the object which represents this stage that I'm in at the moment. And that object has a getter and a setter and a bunch of other attributes that you can access. And from that stage object, I can find the name of the stage. And then once I have that name of the stage, I just put it in a switch statement here that says, hey, look at my stage name. And if it turns out that the answer is choice, then display something. And if the answer is result, then display something else. So we're making progress. Next thing we need to do is to import those components that we've already defined. So in my stage.jsx still, I'll come up to the top here and just import those JSX components that we defined the boilerplates, the empty structures for, from that stages directory that we created. And now that I have that imported, all I can do is just replace these components here. So this will be choice. And then this one here will be result. Cool. Alrighty. I'm going to do a quick server refresh here just to make sure that all of the code that we push to the server side is loaded properly. And let's see what we get once we've put that into practice. So we'll go and create our 2-player game again. And start the game. And come back to our player window. We both go through the instructions. Oh, I've got the same player in 2 windows. It's because I put James in the name field, so it's thought the same person is joined up with 2 different windows. Let's get us a new player there. This one will be James 2. That works. Okay, so now I have 2 separate players. And what we can see is the text that we put into this choice object. So choice component not yet implemented. So this is great because this tells us that we've connected everything properly. This component is displaying when we want it to display. Now we just need to sort of fill in the details. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to tell the player what they are going to be doing in this part of the game. And so I'm going to add some text here, nice emojis and some list styling. This is all just HTML that will tell them what they're going to do. And this is the definition of the prisoner's dilemma from our perspective. You and your partner in crime have been arrested. If you both keep silent, you'll both get 2 months in jail. But if you testify against your partner and he keeps silent, then you get to walk free. If you keep silent, but your partner testifies, you get 12 months in jail. And if you both testify, you both get 6 months. So what do you do? So now we've given them now that we've given them the instructions, we need to give them the choices. They need to be able to make that choice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import a button component from this components folder in the source directory. And these are a few components that ship with the basic Empirica install. And the button component just wraps an HTML button and gives it some styling and some behavior that's nice. And once we've added that button component, then we'll just add 2 buttons, one for keeping silent and one for testifying. So when I save the file, this displays here. So this is a bit ugly. I'm going to clean it up with a little bit of CSS. And Empirica ships with an inline CSS interpreter called Windy. If you're familiar with Tailwind, it's basically the same thing. But this is just a way of specifying some formatting without having to go into a whole lot of depth onto CSS files and managing that overhead. And we're also going to add some margins, some spacing around the button components themselves here. So I got a 5-point margin that surrounds those. And save that, we get some nice formatting for these 2 buttons. Problem is, if I click the buttons, nothing happens. And the reason for that is that we haven't told Empirica what to do with those buttons yet. And so what we'll do is we'll create a function in this component here, right up above the return. And it's going to be our click handler. And I'm going to call it onClick. And this function is going to receive a parameter, which is just the choice that the participant made. And we're going to log that to the console. So I'll just say console log, you chose choice. I'll save this here. And then the next thing I need to do is connect this handler function to those buttons. So what I'll do first is I'll add a click handler here. So the button component takes a handle click attribute. And I'm going to pass it in these braces, it's just JavaScript syntax. So I'm passing an inline function with no arguments that calls onClick as silent. And then I'll do the same for the other button. There we go. When I save this, it formats nicely for me. And then if I open the JavaScript console here, so go to the tools, developer tools, we see the browser console. Browser console is a really useful tool when you're developing your experiment because it lets you display to yourself things that you think are going on in the background. So now when I click this testify button, my console logs what I had asked it to, which is you chose testify. You chose keep silent. All right, so we've got the button hooked up to its handler properly. Next thing we have to do is actually have it save those values. And there's a different value for each player, and each player may have multiple rounds of this game, and they're going to have a different choice in each round. So we're going to need to save this to something that's unique to the player and the round. And the place where we can do this is in the player object, which Empirica provides for us. So we have that hook that we saw before, which is use player. And this use player hook is going to give us a function which we can run and which is just going to return this player object. And then what we'll do, just make some space here and clean this up. What we're going to do is we're going to save that value to player.round. And then we're going to create a key value pair where the key is their decision and the choice is the choice they made, either silent or testify. And then the last thing we need to do with this file is we need to tell Empirica that the player is done. Once they've clicked the button, they've made their choice, they're ready to move on to the next stage of the game. So we'll say, we'll set the player.stage object, so the player has a stage. And in this, we'll set a component called submit to true. And this is going to tell Empirica, I'm ready to move on. And when I save this, I don't need that window anymore. We'll keep silent here. And it just waits for the other players. And here this fellow testifies. Cool, so we've got that part of it working. The next thing we need to do is to build up the result component. And this is going to show the choice that each person made and the results for making those choices. So let's open that up. Here's the template code that we built before. It's got nothing in it yet, just the claim that it's not implemented. And we'll do a lot of the same things that we did in the last component. So we'll start by getting our use player hook. That'll get us that player object. And then we'll import the, create the player object itself. And Empirica actually, in addition to this use player object, has a hook that'll get us all of the players in the game. And this is called use players. And so we'll set that there. And just like with use player, we can get a list of all the different players. Now this is a two-person game, and what we really want to know is the choice of the other player, the opponent. And so what we can do is we can filter the list of all players. A little bit of syntax here. So I'm going to define a variable called the opponent, and it takes this players list. It's going to filter the list with this filtering function, which is going to say for everything in the list, if the ID of that thing in the list does not equal to the ID of the current player, which we got from the use player hook, then keep it, otherwise throw it out. And this should return for us a list of just one item, and we'll get the first element from that list. Okay, so now we're ready to display those values. So we'll keep this div tag here and get rid of some of that intermediate text. And we'll use just a couple paragraph tags to display the result. So I've got just a few pieces here. It says you chose X, your partner chose Y, and you get Z months in jail. And now we just need to fill in those values. So we'll use JavaScript in string templates, which is nice. We can fill in with those backticks here. And if I just replace the XX with this piece of JavaScript, it just says include in the string. That's what this $sign curly brace syntax says. The result of this JavaScript function, which is to go to the player round object and get the value which we set before, which was decision. And we can do this also for the opponent. And so from the opponent's object, I'll get the same things. And what you'll see here actually is I'm using a particular piece of syntax, which is this question mark. So the normal syntax, I've got an object and I've got this dot operator, which lets me access a property of that object. But if the object doesn't exist, or that the property inside it doesn't exist, I want to make sure that I don't throw an error. And so this question mark is just a fallback to make sure that if anything here is missing, I just get a value that I can handle. The last thing we want to display is the player's score, which is the months in jail. And we haven't actually defined this yet, but what we're going to say is that it's going to be set to the player.round object. And we'll come back in a minute or two to define that. But I'll just show you for now what happens. is in our game, the player chose silent, their partner chose testify, and you get undefined months in jail. And we can handle undefined for now. And then we'll just build up what that function is that creates that score. The last thing we want to do in this results object is to add a button that lets us continue on beyond that stage. And so just like we did before, we'll import the button component from the components folder, and then we'll create a button within our div using that component that says continue. Oh. And there it is. And now what we need to do is to add that click handler so that when the button's clicked, it does what it's supposed to. And because this is pretty simple, all it has to do is set that, that submit to true. I can put it in line inside the button component definition. So now when I click this button that says continue for all the players, we now move on to the exit steps. So this exit survey, I'm not going to go into details about it now. It lives in this intro exit folder here. There's intro exit survey. And it's again used in the asynchronous part of the experiment that happens after the game itself. And just like everything else, it's completely customizable. Right, now let's compute the score. This is really easy to do on the server side because this means we can make sure that it's ready for the display stage and we only compute it once. So let's go back to our callbacks function. And the place we're going to do this is on stage ended. And so this callback takes a function, which we're going to define. And this on-stage ended callback is going to get called whenever the stage finishes. And we have two stages in our game, and we only really want to compute the score after the choice component, the choice stage. So the first thing I'm going to do is put in a little guard clause here that says, if the stage name does not equal choice, then return and don't actually compute any scores. Now, on the server, we don't have the hooks that we used in the front end, but we can get the players from the stage object that's provided in the callback. So here's the syntax for that. Don't worry about writing it down. It's all in the documentation. So I'll define an object called players from the stage current game players object. So the next thing we want to do is to loop through all these players with a for loop. So for each player in this list of all players, then I want to compute the score. And as before, we need to know what our opponent is doing in order to compute that score. And we can get the value for the opponent in basically the same way. So we'll take the players list and filter it with a filter function that says for any player that's not the current player, keep it in the list and then take the first value. So now we have the player because it's in the list, and we have their opponent. So we can compute, or sorry, extract their choices. And this time I'm going to save those to a variable because we're going to use them multiple times instead of just display them the one time. And then what I'm going to do is use the table of payoffs that we talked about earlier on and just build this up as a set of if-else statements. So first I define this value score, and if the player chooses testify and their opponent chooses testify, then the player gets a score of 6. And then if the player chooses testify and their opponent chooses silent, it's a score of 0. Silent and testify is score 12, and otherwise it's score of 2. And then the last thing we want to do is set this to the player.round object. That's where we're going to look for it in our display code. I'll save this. And then we'll go ahead and do a quick restart of our server. Create our 2-player game. And then we can walk through it. All right. So here we are for all the players. Keep silent. The other fellow testifies. And oh, he kept silent. He got 12 months in jail, whereas the other guy got off scot-free. So I'm going to stop at this point and give ourselves a few minutes for questions. I have this tutorial built out where we can turn this into a multi-round game. So you get an iterated prisoner's dilemma. and then some discussion about how we can serve this to a server, but I'm not going to go into that today, just to save some time. Thank you for walking through this experiment creation with us. I hope you have a chance to try it out. Don't worry too much if it felt like a lot of code. When I started using Empirica, this would have taken me a lot longer. And I'm just sorry we didn't have time to go into more detail and to slow it down and do it together. Like Mohammed said, we find that most people who get started with just a little knowledge of programming, even if they haven't used React or JavaScript before, are able to get something going in a week or two. And there's this growing community of developers who have experience with Empirica, and they're very friendly. And a lot of folks who are willing to help you implement your own experiments. So thank you so much. And I will share this code as soon as the tutorial is finished.
Yeah, I think Mohammed has been busy answering the questions that were coming up in the Q&A. Let's see if anyone else pops a question in there, but if not, you do have the Slack. So anyone that's on this call, if you try it out, watch the recording and have more questions, then do join the Slack. And I will say maybe, okay, no open questions. Was there any question from those that you already answered, Mohammed, that you think might be useful to just
Yeah, I think maybe it's helpful to kind of reiterate what James said about the community. So someone mentioned that they work in a domain where they see a lot of opportunity, but the technical implementation might be a barrier. And so Empirica is built on general purpose web technologies. There's nothing fancy or kind of like built entirely from scratch, meaning that if you hire your run-of-the-mill developer online, they should be familiar with how React works, with how Node works, and jumping into it should not be a big barrier beyond looking, scrolling through the Empirica documentation. So it's easy to find kind of your run-of-the-mill developer online through platforms like Work. For more specialized experience, we're curating this list of developers who've worked with members of the community, who kind of, we know that they know the platform, they know kind of how people think about their research questions. And so you're able to kind of share a research description with us and kind of the game that you're trying to design. We can share it with that network of freelancers and see if there's a match.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. The last minute of the call, someone is asking, so Carla is asking if it can be used with virtual reality investigations.
Down the road, yes. Today, not yet. The idea of a extensible ecosystem of tools is such that when the time comes when we're going to want to run these experiments, what we'll be able to do is just swap out the web interface for a different type of interface and use the same backends for managing the participants and all the rest of it.
Excellent.
I think there's another question I'll just quickly answer on, can we add images and videos? So the jelly beans that James showed you were an image. Basically anything that you can serve in a web browser. So if you've seen pictures or images on the web and videos, then you can also serve those in your experiments. At the end of the day, you're just showing your experiments, your subjects a website.
Great. Final question, if right to left text. Can you present right to left text? Arabic, Hebrew?
Yeah.
Yes. Great.
There are nice plugins for doing localization as well that are in the web dev ecosystem. I haven't used them with Empirica, but it would be very straightforward to plug in those tools.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, James and Mohammed, for a very detailed demo, and like I'm so relieved actually, and really surprised and excited that it worked and nothing broke. It was really smooth, so well done you. And thank you again for your time. And everyone, if you have follow-up questions, you want to use Empirica, do join the Slack community, and reach out to this anyone from that list of developers or you too.
Great.
Thank
you
everyone
for
so
having
much.
us.
Thank you.